Well, that kind of concludes the very formal panels of the last couple of days, and now we're going to bring it all together and conclude everything that's pretty much been spoken about. So good luck with that, guys, because we've had so much handed to us in the last couple of days. And I'd like to introduce you to the working group summary panel, Food, Farm, Forest, Community. Yesterday, you all had the chance to participate in the working groups and impact the actionable recommendations for increasing sustainable production of the commodities. And now we will hear the recommendations discussed and agreed on from yesterday's working groups. We will be producing a comprehensive outcome and recommendations report on the results, which will be shared with each and every one of you. I'd like to introduce the chair for this final panel of the day, Jason Clay, Senior Vice President Markets and Executive Director of the Markets Institute WWF US. You've heard him speak already, gave a great presentation. And of course, I'd like to invite his panel to join him on stage, please.
Cheers. So the commodities panels are going to report back in this session. We've asked each of the leads to address how to scale. You can sit. How to scale public-private partnerships, how to accelerate the development of new solutions, and to make specific recommendations about what we need to do with each of the commodity groups to improve overall performance. Again, a reminder, the commodities that we're focused on are rice, coffee, palm oil, dairy, sugar, and corn. I also want to remind you or let you know that the recommendations of each of the groups are going to be presented on the side, and in the center we're going to have the pigeonhole screen where you're going to be asked to vote. The screen will be open for each commodity panel presentation, and then it'll shift to the next one, but you can go into Pigeonhole and vote and make corrections on your vote or however you want to do it over time. So I think is this it?
Yeah.
Somehow I'm missing one.
Yeah. Who's missing? There. He doesn't have a chair.
The chair doesn't have a chair.
You can.
Please join.
So let me introduce the panel. We have Bruce Tolentino, the Deputy Director General of IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, who chaired the rice panel. We have Melanie Rutten-Sülz, the Executive Director of the Global Coffee Platform and Chair of the Coffee Panel. We had Darrel Weber, the Chief Executive Officer of the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, who chaired palm oil. We had Gert Vanderbilt, the International Program Coordinator for Livestock with Solidaridad, who led the dairy panel. Nicolas Viart, the Head of Standards and Innovation with Bonsucro, headed the sugar panel. And Subash Dasgupta, the Senior Plant Production Officer with the FAO Regional Office, chaired the corn panel. So we want to start by having each person report in 2 to 3 minutes the recommendations that came back from your group. They're going to be on the side screens, and I think you've all got them. So we'll start with Bruce.
Okay, thank you.
Talking about rice.
On the podium or right here?
I think you can do it right there, just from your seat.
Right. Rice. I wonder how many of you noticed that over lunch we had 3 or 4 different kinds of rice being served. And I saw many having a sample of each. So in the discussions, we had a very, very rich set of presentations, beginning with Bapak Hussein from East Java, providing a farmer's perspective, and moderated by Dr. Arifin from the University of Lampung. I'm also grateful to the panelists who participated in the program, Anh Tuan from Vietnam, Mahesh Girdhar, and Dr. Tutuk, and of course Matthias Bickel, Yannick Foing, and Mias Pisset from Cambodia. We were instructed to summarize all of the results into one slide, and it's flashed on the screen. And forgive me if it's just too summarized because the discussion was very, very rich. And let me just go through them very quickly. First, ASEAN +3 must enact policy programs and funds. So it's not just talk. It must be backed up by action, programs and funds. And that's one of the main problems of ASEAN so far. Lots of meetings, almost 360 meetings a year, but not much action. We need action now. Action to smooth out the volatility of prices in the short run and to ensure that we have long-term solutions for natural resource degradation and climate change. Indeed, as Jason pointed out earlier, we do need to reduce the footprint of rice, among other commodities, and rice is one of the largest footprints on the planet. That's why we need innovative R&D. We need higher yields to farm more intensively, use less land, use less resources, climate-smart varieties, and lower-cost, sustainable, good agricultural practices, summarized in initiatives like the Sustainable Rice Platform, in which many of you are now participating. We also need R&D to ensure that farmers are able to manage pests and diseases. Pak Hussein reminded us that one of his main problems was how to deal with pest and disease. And also, we're running into the unfavorable rice areas. Here in Indonesia, the government is asking for technology that will enable them to farm in swamplands. That's a real challenge. So we've got R&D, we've got funding from government. How do we enable all of these technologies to reach farmers? We need scale. And that scale is achieved through public-private partnerships involving all the players transferring knowledge to farmers, enabling them to discover and experience as they go along. In Pak Hussein's case, he said he never saw the government, but he saw Syngenta. I'm not advertising Syngenta, by the way, but he saw Syngenta and learned from that process. Now, small farmers can't really compete. They need safety nets. Safety nets, including crop insurance and other social protection measures, so that farmers can compete and thrive. In Indonesia, there are examples of that running already. The conditional cash transfer program is such a safety net. Also, the Kecamatan development program is such a safety net. It doesn't have to be directly agriculture, but it enables the farming family to get through the season and survive. Finally, ASEAN +3 must continue to promote open trade, open exchange of information, consider a futures market, and share much more information. ASEAN now has the ASEAN +3 rice reserve, but it's very small and it's very slow. All of these things together will enable the rice farmers to thrive and all of us to be able to get 4 kinds of rice over lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm going to ask Melanie to report back from the coffee panel.
Yes, thank you, Jason. Well, I was, I think, equally privileged with a really great working group. And you, it's okay? Yeah. I think it's working now with the mic up. No, I was equally privileged with having really a great... I did not listen.
Okay.
What an introduction. Wow. Okay. So I don't move. Okay. No, don't move either.
Just leave it. Just leave
No, we will just leave it. Just leave it. Darrel, please. Yeah. No, what an introduction.
Put it on your room.
I always want to make a scene, huh?
Yeah, exactly. No, so. Yeah. No, so really great, great panelists. We had an introduction from 2 farmers in Lampung. We had great panelists, Veronica, Pasita, Imran, and Fitrian sharing their input, and most importantly, the participants.
They really endured, they engaged, we even skipped the coffee break, and they couldn't stop talking and exchanging, so it will be a challenge to summarize all this. Now, coming to the concrete recommendations. Number one, strengthen existing public-private partnership platforms. And there was a great example from the Sustainable Coffee Platform of Indonesia, launched 1 year ago, where discussions evolved around what are the learnings, what are the success factors. So strengthening platforms through communication and relationship building at national level to build a central place where all the discussions around sustainability can actually happen, making it action-oriented, focusing on each member's strengths and core competences, setting clear priorities, and agreeing on shared goals to build a longer-term strategy and actually align on the critical issues. Critical issues such as being, for example, rejuvenation, where actually there was no consensus whose role it is, but definitely one of the top issues to be tackled. And then ultimately, through all this, creating an enabling environment for change. Number two, scaling and improving capacity building for smallholder coffee growers. How? Through local farmer associations, through partnerships with government, with NGOs and others, businesses, choosing the partners to bring in the expertise that is needed, using local change agents to localize success and really show by example, and with a focus on basic, and really the emphasis, basic sustainable agricultural practices. There was some examples where even really the pure basics can already have such an impact. Including agroforestry, financial literacy, and encouraging access for women and the youth. And there again, the example bringing in partners like the IWCA, the Women in Coffee Alliance. And then combining these two recommendations, next week the National Sustainability Curriculum for Indonesia will be launched, which is one of the first really very concrete products of this Scopy platform, which will be aligning all capacity building and training material here for Indonesia coffee production. So great examples. Third recommendation, encourage partnerships, and that was more around the productivity. So encourage partnerships between agribusiness and smallholders to develop new business models for tailored and targeted access to affordable agriculture inputs. What does it mean? It's more, tailored offers, pay-as-you-go fertilizer or group orders, so innovative ways to making it accessible for farmers. Somebody said, no bean, no brew. That was Imran, and I think, it all starts, with the productivity. But then, of course, also looking not only at the quantity, but at the quality, and that is the fourth recommendation, to actually support effective farmer organizations to improve value-added services and increase smallholder revenue. How? Through, for example, improved product quality, by improved access to processing facilities, especially drying and sorting equipment, and then also market differentiation. So separating the beans, that it's not all going in one bulk, but actually you can separate and you have added value and a differentiation. And information, and that was, I think, I found the most striking, like including innovative tools like text messaging on daily price transparency. And that is actually apparently happening in other commodities in Indonesia, but nobody did it for coffee yet, which is a very simple thing and super effective in providing this transparency for producers actually to take an informed selling decision. So that's a summary of the harvest we had. Thank you.
Thank you. So Darrel, what were the recommendations that came out of Palmore?
Thanks very much. I'll try not to create such a dramatic entrance. First of all, we had a tremendous session. We had a large group, more than 100 people, I think, in the beginning, and then it tapered down to, 80 people maybe at the end. Very thankful to the great input we had at the session. My thanks goes out in particular to our smallholder hero, Pak Bambang. I don't know if he's here. Thank you very much for such great contributions. We had John Hartman from Cargill, Pak Fadil from Gapki, Gots from Golden Agri, and Hans from SNV. So good experts to provide input into the discussions. Now, prior to, of course, this session, all of the panelists and me got together in a teleconference, and we worked out some draft proposals already. We had 5, and basically the tables discussed those 5 proposals, and they were free to edit the proposals, delete, improve, etc., etc. And these are the summaries. I'm not sure if I should read it out, because I'm sure you can read it faster than I can read it out, but I'll try anyway to outread you. First proposal was government should improve consistencies of its laws across jurisdictions to help organize local farmer associations to share information on legal issues, better agriculture practice, and the government should enforce its practices. Well, I mean, there's a lot to discuss about this, but some of the points that could support this further, and this came out from the discussion, was perhaps we should have a jurisdictional approach so that the laws could be looked at more holistically and to better inform people and use this jurisdictional approach to share best practices in a more efficient manner. There was a suggestion with regards to this proposal is that private sector and government must not shy away in addressing social conflicts related to palm oil expansion. Government outreach and advisory officers should be made available for independent smallholders. And this is strange. It was new to me that there's no outreach officers for smallholders in Indonesia, whereas all the other agriculture sectors and livestock had extension officers from the government. So I didn't realize this. And that's something that's a gap that must be plugged. And of course, there should be a national platform to share best practices. I think many people point to all these new technologies. There's mobile technology, there's internet, there's satellite, what have you, that you can use to share across regions what are the best practices, agricultural practices. We now go to the second recommendation, where we say we must build financial extension services to provide capital and best growing practices to smallholder, and the outreach cost should be shared across the supply chain. Now, everybody likes the idea of sharing the cost across a supply chain. No one has the answer. RSPO is one tool, but then it's not an attractive enough tool to share that cost. There needs to be more effort in that space. Now, I don't know if many of you know, but many companies, the large plantation companies, are the guarantors for smallholders when it comes to applying for loans. And this is a big financial risk for the companies. They do this, they don't often get the praise that they deserve in doing this, but also the reality is they face some risks in doing so, and they would like some kind of innovation along these lines. The proposal number 3, improve monitoring on the ground. Government and private sector to provide ultra transparency in monitoring of fires and deforestation via publicly available information of maps to credibly distance the industry from haze allegations. Now, the issue of haze and deforestation has long been attributed to the palm oil sector. It's not always true, and many companies wanting to keep their reputation intact find it very difficult to explain to the public that they are not the cause of the haze, or they are not the source of these fires. And they find one of the best tools is to be ultra transparent, have their maps online in the public domain, so that stakeholders could see for themselves where the fires are in relation to their concessions. Everyone thought it was a good idea. However, there may be some limitations in the laws, maybe in Indonesia, maybe even Malaysia. And it was also noted that the One Map initiative already started by Indonesian government should be promoted and should be encouraged further. The fourth proposal is to align the palm industry as a leader championing the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been noted that I think a lot of people from the floor or from tables said that at least 9 of the Sustainable Development Goals can be well, the palm oil industry could align themselves easily with at least 9 out of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And maybe the palm oil industry should report on its progress in a more structured way in order to fit the language of the world, because the language of the world in the next coming 5 to 10 years will be along Sustainable Development Goals. It should, recommendations from the floor regarding this proposal is to leverage the Indonesian Unified Database. I don't know if you know what that is. It escaped me what it means, but apparently 40% of forest information is already captured in this database, which can measure the impact and progress of initiative taken towards these sustainable development goals. We should give recognition to companies that promote sustainable development goals. The private sector must engage the government to align itself with the sustainable development goals. Proposal number 5, activate government, private sector, civil society, and local communities to design and implement long-term plans to adapt to climate change. Now, it's my view and the other panelists' view as well that although we talk a lot about climate change, avoidance, mitigation, but there's seldom a realization that climate change is happening today, and there's seldom plans, long-term plans by the sector to address what they're going to do in the next 5 to 10 years in the face of the inevitable rise in sea levels, the extreme weather patterns. No one in the sector is really doing this on a programmatic way. And the last recommendation is government should make specific rules for independent smallholders, as these smallholders are very distinct from the plasma smallholders. So therefore, there should be more specific guidelines for independent smallholders. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darrel. Now we'll hear from Gert about the dairy panel.
Thank you very much. Well, it seems my mic is working. We had a much more intimate group, I think, than the palm oil group had. That's the advantage of not having a politically sensitive sector. We had a group of 30, 40 people with representatives from the dairy sector, the private sector. We were very glad to start with a farmer's perspective because we all agreed that's important to start from that perspective. But we also had NGOs and government representatives, both national and international, in our group. And I would first like to start with saying that the dairy sector may not be politically sensitive, but if we look at the role of the dairy sector in the economy, in livelihoods in the area, but also in nutrition in the area, it may well be one of the most important sectors around here. And secondly, if we look at the characteristics of the countries here, in all Asian countries, the dairy sector is dominated by really small farmers with 1, 2, 3, 4 cows. It's scaling up, but still very small scale. But also, all the Asian countries are importers of dairy products. And also in the longer term, it's quite difficult to imagine that the dairy sector in Asia will be able to compete with Australia or the US. But that doesn't mean that there is no good future for dairy farming in the area. This is the area where the dairy production is increasing at the fastest rate in the world. The demand is increasing, and an important part of that demand will be supplied by farmers in this area. So then going to our recommendations, well, the first, and not surprisingly, what we said is that public-private partnerships are important to encourage investment in technical support and professionalization of the sector. So partnerships between government, private sector, research institutes and NGOs. But what was added there is that it is important that the private sector takes the lead. Not governments, not NGOs, they have a role to play, but the private sector should take the lead. But that also requires a sense of responsibility from the private sector to invest in smallholder development. And one element of investment should definitely be scaling up of the sector. As I said, the dairy sector is really small scale, and to professionalize the sector, we need to scale up the sector to make the sector attractive for young farmers to step in, but also to make it more professional. And I think it is important to realize that dairy is certainly one sector where increasing productivity can easily go hand in hand with a higher carbon efficiency, but also with better animal welfare and better animal health. So you can kill a number of birds with one stone. A second point, I already said that we were very glad that we started with a farmer perspective. Often if we talk about public-private partnerships, one group is forgotten, and that is the farmers. What was stressed in our group that it is very important that in these partnerships farmers have an equal say and to invest in empowerment of farmers. And I think it was also Jenny that said this morning, if we talk about farmers in the dairy sector, a large part of that farmers are women farmers. So it's absolutely crucial to also work on women empowerment in the dairy sector. Also to have strong and proud farmers that can be role models for young farmers to step in. Well, if we look at what is really crucial for the professionalization and strengthening of the dairy sector, then we all agreed that milk quality, and that will be true in all the countries in the region here, is absolutely crucial. So what is needed is more investment in education of farmers, more investment in hardware, cooling technology, for instance, at farm level or at cooperative level, but also in testing and in controlling of milk quality. And coming back to the second point, it is important that milk quality is not brought to farmers as something from the outside. So one suggestion done was to have quality testing labs that are both endorsed by governments, private sector and farmers, to avoid that quality controls are just seen by farmers as something brought to them from the outside, but they also see themselves as the owner of quality. Well, related to that investments in quality, what is needed, and also that's definitely not something which is true in the dairy sector only, is new financial models to ensure that farmers have access to finance and have access to funding at individual level, but also at cooperative level. And funding is needed to intensify and professionalize farming. Funding is needed to intensify and professionalize dairy farming. And often, well, what is the problem is the risk of banks and financial institutions to loan to farmers. So we definitely see a role for governments, but maybe also for private sector to reduce risk for financial institutes to loan to farmers. And then lastly, what is certainly a very important issue in the region when we talk about development of dairy farmers, that is the availability of both land, water, and that comes back to a large extent to the availability of feed. One suggestion and one concrete action that was suggested is to make a real concrete mapping at regional level of what is the potential for feed availability. Can include molasses from sugarcane, can include palm kernel expellers, but it is important for the further development of dairy to really be aware what feed can be made available, also to avoid that dairy development will lead to water depletion, for instance, to really select regions where there is the most potential, but also, for instance, to avoid that further intensification of the dairy sector will lead to a competition between feed and food. And what is, in the end, what we want to promote is that the dairy sector will further contribute to livelihoods and better nutrition in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Gert. Nicolas, what about sugar?
Thank you very much, Jason. So I was looking at, we were all discussing the sugar working group, which was even more intimate, I think, working group than the dairy one. And that was a bit of a surprise, but I think the concentration of knowledge and expertise was great. So we had very good discussion with representative of all the supply from the farmer up or down to the end users and buyers of sugar. So it was really good level. And just to restate a bit, sugarcane represents the third agriculture commodity in Southeast Asia with 190 million tons produced annually. So it's not a little crop, it's a hugely important crop for the area, involving a lot of smallholders and supporting a lot of communities. So we really strive to find with a working group how we can make it sustainable and how we can enhance sustainability. And one of the main things was, of course, collaboration. But also, I would almost say attractiveness, how we can attract more actors around the sugarcane sector and bring more partners to bring sustainability to a higher level. So we invite all of you who have expertise to join and to support the sector in its journey to sustainability. So the first point was support technical improvement for farmers. So it's really looking at what the farmers are needing to improve their productivity, timely access to fertilizers, irrigation, access to finance, and better quality of seed of canes, and as well how we can work with stopping burning activities and do more fresh cane. So this is, for the whole area, is relevant. We want as well innovative development to prepare the future ahead of the future challenges, climate change, but as well how we can attract high quality workforce into the sector. And it was a little occasion to maybe say thank you to all the students from the Bangor University who have helped us into those working groups, because I think their participation is very important, because they will be the one continuing what you're doing today and keeping the sustainability going forward. And I think having them from the start on board with us is very crucial, and that helps to rate the quality and the attractiveness of the agriculture sector, which we know worldwide is a bit a challenge to keep people coming and working in the agriculture sector. Second point is to empower and strengthen the organization of local farmer associations to increase collaboration and knowledge sharing. So there is a lot of different models that exist. The Fair Trade one is one of them to support organization of farmers, and there is other that exist across the globe. So again, with collaboration and knowledge sharing, we can help the farmers to associate themselves and support better organization and knowledge sharing. Then in the sugarcane sector, the farmer and the miller association or the farmer and miller cooperation is very crucial to make the most of the crop and to ensure high efficiencies of the productivity and production of the cane. So we need to strive for a strong and mutually beneficial relationship between farmers and miller to gain efficiencies in sugar production at mill and farm level. For example, help and support the continuous and organized supplies of cane from the farm to the mill. So helping into all the activities from planting to harvesting, collaboration between the farmers and the millers. Then we want to encourage as well the governments to work with sector actors to develop a coherent regulatory framework that promotes a stepwise approach to support and improve domestic production, leading to increased competitiveness. The word competitiveness came a lot into the discussions. Farmers are businesses and they want to be competitive in their activities, so to thrive their activities. So we need to support them, and the governments, when defining the legislation, need to support those activities. So as well, if we can encourage the government and the actors to collaborate into designing the legal framework, we will really support those objectives. And finally, so taking the cross-regional level, we want to build on existing cross-regional collaboration initiatives, such as the Asian Alliance for Sugarcane, which will be launched this July 2016 in Bangkok. And we encourage transparent and multi-stakeholder participation at all levels, including farmer association, mill association, buyers, financial institution, and support organization, to help information to be shared across the different actors, from the farmer association across themselves, the research association among themselves, and anybody who can bring their knowledge to the table and to support the whole Asian region as a whole, as a country of production or region of production.
Thank you. Subash, can you talk to us about corn?
Hello, thank you.
It's on.
Thank you. And just, I would like to first of all thank three of our farmers who participated in our discussions, and more than 60 participants having varied expertise. we are in our discussion session. What is important for us that our room was packed until we end the session. So a lot of issues came up in the discussions, but unfortunately we have no space to accommodate all of those issues, and due to space limitation. But we tried our best to reflect, considering the short-term and medium-term actionable briefs that can be adopted and implemented by the governments and other stakeholders. It also came up that maize is becoming a 21st century crop in Asian countries. It is expanding very rapidly, and also demand is growing, and this crop is also main feed for poultry sector. 70% of maize in the Asian countries are used for poultry sector. So that's why demand is very high, but productivity is ranging from 2 tons to 8 tons. So there is a very big variation across the region on the productivity of corn in Asian countries. So there is very big scope to further increase production and productivity of the corn in Asia. So that's why obviously production and productivity dominated the whole discussions in our panel. Another issue is that the wide adaptability of this crop across the agroecological settings and regions make this crop as a climate smart crop. In addition to that, it was also told that it is a drought resistant crop due to deep root systems and less water use than rice and wheat. So this crop has a lot of advantages, and based on other issues that came up in the discussion is the mechanization, post-harvest losses, and supply of inputs, marketing, and access to technology, harmonization of the policies, access to information, all of these issues came up. But in summary, we came up with 4 recommendations. But so I will just read out, you can see there. And first recommendation is the private-public partnership, because must accelerate the development and deployment of high-yielding climate-resilient corn seeds and facilitate its access. Main issue came up is the availability of quality hybrid seeds of corn at the doorstep of smallholder farmers. There is a still big problem because every year they have to change the seeds. So, and public sector cannot do it, and private sectors also are not that much organized to meet the country demand due to funding constraints. So public-private partnership it can be one instrumental issue then to promote the quality hybrid seeds of corn in this region. Our second point is the improved farmer education, because it is a knowledge-intensive technology. Lot of things, as I mentioned, the productivity raised from 2 tons to 8 tons. To increase the productivity, the farmer's agronomy is very important. So it is widely varied. So that's why we have to increase their knowledge level, and through extension staff to encourage sustainable and added value production through scaling up innovations, chassis, information communication technology tools, sustainable corn production intensification, conservation agriculture, and climate smart agriculture practices with a special focus on youth and women. It was also discussed that the labor scarcity during particularly planting and harvesting time, so that we have to through SME system the youth to stay with agriculture. And finally, our third policy will be advice to the government, Asian government, because policy-led growth is important. So that's why, and our third recommendation is Asian government should create policies incentivizing the private sector that help a smallholder improve sustainable production and productivity of corn through availability of agricultural inputs, access to drying and storage facilities, and investment in R&D, mainly private sector investment, especially through protecting IP rights. So the issue is that it's very difficult at the farmers' field to make the drying because land scarcity. They don't have land to dry their crops, and also storage facilities because it has cost involvements. So that's why government should have private sector policy so that we can see the emergences of private sector at the rural areas to create the facilitation in the drying and storage, and also investment in R&D, particularly adaptive research and development system on the ecosystem basis. And finally, increase opportunity for smallholders along the supply chain. It was much discussed in the morning, and in order for them to develop more value-added products to enhance their livelihoods. The issue is that in the whole value chain and supply chain system, farmers' involvement only as a primary producers. So that's why in the whole chain, we do not see that much involvement of the smallholder farmers, at least to increase their income so that they can enhance their livelihoods. So in view of that, we feel that a smallholder involvement in value addition of their primary products is very important. And value chain and the value chain systems also will improve supply chain at the national and international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Subash. So one of the things that struck me about public-private partnerships is that in many parts of the world, governments have taken a step back from a lot of their involvement in production in different aspects of agriculture. What do you see in this region around these commodities, the role of government actually being versus what we'd like it to be? Is there a gap there that needs to be filled? How is that going to change? Many governments are about getting reelected rather than making the investments that are needed in education or infrastructure or other things to push more sustainable agriculture or intensification of agriculture. Any thoughts? Did this come up in your discussions? I mean, it takes two to tango. You have to have both government and private sector for a public-private partnership.
What came up in the discussions is the need to have a stable and long-visioned legal framework. So really having the governments to have to make the right decision that support, in collaboration with the actors, with the farmers and the millers in the sugarcane sector, to define the right rules or the right laws with the right objective at the pace that fits both the legal and the country objective as well as the producer objectives. So it's really to reinforce this collaboration so one doesn't go ahead of the other, and which at the end doesn't bring any visibility.
Actually, this public-private partnership, it has not been working at the country level, particularly in developing countries, in Asian countries, because the mandate of the government and mandate of the private sectors are completely different. They could not, unfortunately, in the public sector, they already allocated a lot of monies in their budget to bring private sector in the business. But unfortunately, somehow, it is not possible to use this money by the private sector. It is not the fault of private sector, but public rules and regulation is so rigid, and so that they cannot come up with a common platform on how to use these resources, and also private sector, how can more involvement of private sector in the public-private partnership. Because public sector is more inclined to food security type of issue, national food security, household food security. On the private sector, more important for them is also profit in addition to food security and other things. So that's why issue is that how to help the countries to come up in common platform to minimize the differences and to initiate as early as possible public-private partnership initiative in each country to moving ahead.
Any other comments?
A phrase that kept coming up in the discussion is an enabling framework, a regulatory framework where the government sets the rules of the game, and the rules of the game are fair and enable all parties to participate on an equal footing. When that enabling framework is not fair, then you've got the problems that Subash has just pointed out. For example, when governments attempt to circumvent or subvert the banking system by doing lending themselves, then it runs into problems.
So just picking up on that, I mean, if you look at what happened after 2005, 2006 with the rising prices in commodities, we saw a global trend which was for a decade or 20 years to move away from subsidies, really become picked up, and governments started subsidizing agriculture much more because there was money to be made selling commodities, exports or even for domestic consumption. So the BRICS, for example, just those countries had subsidies that were multiples of the US and Europe combined. And it's interesting to see now that the economic bubble, or at least the heat has come off, the boil's come off the heat a bit, so there's less money available to governments. They're stepping back from that. But virtually everything that has been talked about has to be paid for by somebody. And the question is, who's going to pay for that?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to add, what was mentioned also in our group, is the importance of governments investing in research and development. And I think that's definitely one role that the government should take, apart from having a long-term consistent policy. And I think if we look at the role that government has played in many of the sectors around here, subsidy has not always been very successful, be it input subsidy, be it output subsidy. And I think that's not the best role that the government can play. But it doesn't mean that there is no role for government. And when it comes to who is going to pay for what, well, what was said in my group, the private sector should take the lead, so the private sector should also invest there. But in co-creation with the government, there is a role for government there, definitely, certainly to invest also in infrastructure and also to invest in, together with NGOs and private sector in education of farmers.
But I think one of the things that we've seen is that as government stepped up spending, it funded business as usual. It didn't fund unusual business. It didn't fund innovation. It didn't really fund the things that get us to the next generation or the new type of agriculture we're going to need. And so a lot of these recommendations are calling for that type of investment.
Because a lot of the investment have gone in quite ineffective subsidies, for instance. And,
right, price supports or other mechanisms, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to add something that maybe less specifically on certain governments or policies, but I think what I'm very pleased to hear from all the commodities is this public-private collaboration, but also platforms and yeah, collective collaboration. I think what we're seeing in many different commodities sectors is yeah, more efforts towards sector transformation and learning from the past. Yeah, I mean, we have, looking at coffee, we have like 15 years mainstreaming sustainability in coffee. We have the great work of the sustainability standards. We have the great work of the many different actors, the companies, the NGOs, and everybody has been doing that. Yeah, we have a common code, yeah, with a core baseline agreement. We have been building the 4C association with, yeah, trying to accelerate. But still, besides all these learnings, we are yet still at the beginning. So I think now what we're seeing is also in a way, yeah, the need to really scale, accelerate, build on that, and align towards this sector transformation. And what we did in coffee, about 1 year ago, we launched a collaboration with the International Coffee Organization and the 4C Association and IDH to initiate this, what we call Vision 2020. And of course, well, because Vision 2020 we started 2012, but now we're already so much advanced, but with a vision to really have a public-private framework for defining where the journey is going, and then be able to align, measure, increase investments in a very targeted way. And all this is now, also now with the Global Coffee Platform, becoming, this hub facilitating this. I think we're at the start. It's starting, and it's actually, it's going to completely change the way how we're doing things. It's also, I mean, the sustainable development goals were mentioned. We need to translate them. We need to make them actionable for, well, in our case for coffee, but then, I mean, that's equally the same for other commodities, so that we actually can then also have access to governments, mobilize them, and do the right things where they are needed.
So let me ask the group then. Coffee has come to the point of having a platform. It's only taken 45 years to get there, from about 1970 till today. We don't have 45 years for all these other commodities. How do we get these platforms built quicker? And I think one of the impediments is the private sector itself. They haven't in the past been willing to work together. They've seen sustainability as a competitive issue. It's something you market on the shelf. It's a brand differentiator. It's not a pre-competitive issue, which is what it actually is. Everybody depends on having raw materials. Everybody depends on having supplies in the future. Nobody can fix it by themselves. Nobody's big enough. They've all got to work together. How does that affect the public-private partnerships we need? A lot of the public-private partnerships I see are individual companies working with individual governments. That's not going to transform sectors. So how does that actually shift? How do your recommendations address that?
So I think for what we see in the sugarcane sector, there is frustration and need to scale up much quicker, and we feel it from almost all the part, from the farmers saying we need much more support and we need to achieve something, better productivity. We need the mills say there is a need to secure our supply for long term, and we have clients and customers who demand sustainability and proof of sustainability. And the buyer say we need to have something. So we are forced to think differently, to really scale up the way we organize our sustainability activities and how we organize more the sustainability sugarcane sector. And having just closing ourselves not to listen to anybody else but just what we think is right is definitely not going further. So we see it doesn't embrace enough, it doesn't engage enough. It's a bit like here today, how we can get everybody to come and to realize that there is a need in sugarcane, and we need to collaborate all together. We need to have all that knowledge that everybody holds individually, that I don't hold alone and you don't hold alone, but we all have collaboratively. How we get that to the service of the sugarcane sector, if I speak for sugarcane sector. It's really a call for action, a call for bring your knowledge and share it with who you want to.
One of the biggest lessons of the last 50 years is that when we envision the role for government vis-a-vis the private sector, is that the fundamental role of government is to provide public goods. And in many cases, government is not providing those necessary public goods. We spoke in general about an enabling environment, but somebody's got to build the roads. Somebody's got to provide the core irrigation support. Somebody's got to provide law and order. Somebody's got to provide peace and order services. Somebody's got to provide arbitration services.
Enforce the laws.
Yes. And once those basics are provided, private sector can thrive.
I just come back to you on those points. It's funding business as usual, and this link public-private initiatives. Why is it not working? The sense I got from the group is the public sector is lagging in terms of knowledge on sustainability issues. They may have the knowledge, but they don't know how to implement it on the ground. And there's this divide in private sector and public sector and transfer of knowledge, and that includes the civil society sector when I say private sector. The other issue, I think, my own view is that people rely on the policy as a solution. Policy, to me, is a very blunt instrument. It needs to be sharpened by the private sector and the civil society, and there needs to be a recognition of that, so that there will be a baton passing from the public sector to the private sector to make sure that the policies, this blunt instrument, gets sharpened over time and reviewed. My own view, one way to do that really is, the public sector is very scared to try on new things because it's risky, they lose votes. But they also lack inspiration on a scalable level. And I think a jurisdictional approach is needed to show at a subnational level where things can go right, where policies, blunt instruments are sharpened to very high precision, so that things can be, so that for public sector can take confidence, wow, this is scalable, I can do this. If this can happen in one jurisdiction, I can do it in many others.
Yeah, and I think we just have to accept it takes some time. You need to have someone or an organization to take the leadership, the initiative, but then identifying like-minded organizations and having transformational leadership as well that is bold enough to set the agenda, but then also courageous enough to leave enough room for others. And it takes time. And there's also all sorts of, it won't work if we cannot build a sector, a future-proof sector, be it any sector, if not everybody feels it's their own interest to benefit, to contribute and to get something out of it, but also to give something into it.
I think that we've got to realize that better is better. We keep waiting, many groups keep waiting for perfect solutions. They're not out there. They're never going to be out there, but better is better. Continuous improvement is about getting better. Getting to 2050 means that whatever is more sustainable today won't be tomorrow. I would say there is no such thing as best practice. There are better practices, and what's better for one farmer won't be better for another. And so we need to be very nimble in how we think about these things.
Well, what I wanted to add is that I agree with you that the more that the private sector sees sustainability as something pre-competitive, the easier it will become to line up with governments. And I hope that will happen through landscape or jurisdictional approach, that their private sector and NGOs will join together working in one region, which will make it easier to join up with governments in that region. But that needs to happen at national and global level as well. And what I see, for instance, in the dairy sector, the different dairy companies are still working a bit on their own. There is a dairy sustainability framework, but that doesn't really lead to pre-competitive cooperation. And I think there is more urgency needed there. And I think it's a bit similar in other sectors as well, to really work together in a pre-competitive way.
Subash.
Another point that one of the options is that poor governance in the public sector is hampering the increased involvement of private sector in the system under public-private partnership. So better governance, our good governance can enhance the more private sector to work with the public sector. So in the governance sector is still poor in the most of the Asian countries, not all countries, of course. So that's why one issue is the good governance. And second point is that more involvement of private sector in policy and strategy development and also budget development. Government is reluctant to involve private sector in this process. So it is the responsibility of the private sector to involve themselves, to impress government through their technical knowledge and funding capacity, to be more involved in the policy formulation, strategy formulation, and budget formulation system, and also to show their capacity to change the policy and strategic document time to time to accommodate the changing circumstances, both nationally, regionally, and globally. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I can add to that. I mean, from our experience, even you don't have to go to Asia to look at this difference. I mean, even I'm based in Germany, and going to the German Coffee Association, you talk to the big guys who are all have their strategies lined up and fully executed, and then you have the smaller companies who are starting to ask these questions and completely understand the business relevance of sustainability going forward, but then are completely, sometimes lost in finding, in really understanding how the supply chains work, because they're just, sourcing through the importers and really are, but are now in the spotlight to come up with something. And I think we need to have an all-inclusive approach. I think looking at also, engaging with the leaders to move forward and show the way, but then also having really ready-made solutions for the other ones, and to combine that. Because ultimately it's also about, sector transformation. One really important part is the market transformation as well, in the sourcing and in the supply chains.
The other difference, I think, between publicly held companies and family-held companies is that the family-held companies can make investments that are generational and are willing to take a much longer-term approach. In fact, virtually all of the world's trading companies were privately held by families because they couldn't possibly let their strategies become known to their competitors. So that as soon as they went public, they went bankrupt, or they got bought out, or they failed. But Mars, that was just mentioned, is a privately held company too, and they're making long-term plays on this. So we have a question from the audience. Shouldn't we involve the financial sector in this forum? And it's posed as a statement that they're responsible for high prices on commodities with their speculations. I'd say that's a question as opposed to a statement, a fact. But what about bringing the private financial institutions into this discussion?
Well, for at least the work that I do, the financial institutions are super important. They help. I've seen so many companies change behavior at the threat of financial institutions pulling back loans, pulling out financial instruments from there, or investment houses taking away their equity, pulling out equity from those companies. So I've seen so many changes, so much changes in the upstream side because of financial institutions. So they're very, very important, and they're included definitely in the work that I do.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
It's not a question of trying to get the financial companies into rice. They're already there. In fact, they're quite dominant. In rice in particular, all across Asia, perhaps outside of China, the banks are already lending to rice mills. And the rice mill is the fulcrum of contact between the private sector and the farmer. No matter how governments try to reach the farmer directly, unless they're able to work with the rice mills, nothing will happen. And the financing is centered on that tipping point, as you might call it. Right.
Well, I would like to add that I see the importance of the financial sector in two aspects. Like Darrel said, the way that banks are influencing companies is really becoming larger. More and more banks have codes of conduct and say to their loanees, if you don't act according to our code of conduct, you're just out. But a second thing that I want to stress is that I see more and more all kind of impact investors that can be interesting to really drive innovations and to really show examples of what is possible in terms of sustainability. And I think that's also a very interesting development.
So let me push back on that a bit. Do you actually see more impact investing or more talk about impact investing? I mean, I've never seen an actual description of what an impact investment is.
You have impact investors in all kinds of ways, but what I do see is that more and more investors are looking into other things than just what is the money that I can get out of it? And I think that is a really important and interesting development. And there are people that all of a sudden earned a lot of money in ICT that are really focusing on sustainability, but that's just a small number. But there is a whole scala of impact investors that at least are more interested in more than just what is the money that I can get out of it. And I think that is interesting, and that should also force us to think more in terms of business cases, in terms of both profit and sustainability.
But I think it'd be great also to reach some kind of an agreement about what is minimally required to be an impact investment, or to call yourself or to raise money through that mechanism.
Yeah, or how can you stimulate them or make them go a bit further in the impact they want?
I think it's important that we, as well in the thinking we have, is to really help financial innovation, but for maybe not with the term of investing, but financing, helping the finance of the small farmers or the one who have less ability to access directly to finance and to resources. So in sugarcane, often it goes through the mills, really, like in the rice. So it's not a free, it's a difficult relationship between the mill and the farmer. So it can be very helpful, but it can be very bad. So how we can help to empower farmers is empowering to have his own access to finance, but looking through microfinancing and all the kind of small new way of financing is very helpful. And we need to attract this kind of new generation of thinking for finance and not the more traditional ways through banks and all that.
So another question from the floor is, what about responsible reporting? In some of the work we've begun to do, we've been asking Bloomberg and some of the other entities that post information about companies why they're not actually including not just what the companies spend on commodities, but which commodities they actually buy and how much. Because that looks at their risk, whether management is even aware of risk associated with different commodities, what they're doing about it, and it lets investors have a much better idea.
Yeah, I think I would say it's almost like, do you want to label you could count how many of your products are with a label and certified as sustainable. It's a way to measure sustainability or risk against how you mitigate your risk in that area. It's one way, it's one tool to me. I think the most important is that the change is happening on the ground, that really the community is doing, having an impact, really looked after and really improve what they're doing, millers, farmers, and that I would be careful about focusing only on how people report and what they're doing. It's, let's do the job, and after we can discuss what has been achieved, but let's do it first.
Yeah, I think transparency is absolutely important, but not only for the reporting purpose, but also for really understanding where the issues are. And what we're going to put up as also part of of bringing the different pieces together is a global progress framework where actually on an impact indicator basis we want to measure and have everyone, all members reporting into that. And that will actually bring more, everybody will know where we are collectively as a sector, but also companies can use this as a tool for better planning. It's not only about the companies, but it's also really about the intermediaries, about the farmer organizations themselves, about NGOs. And then ultimately we have also more accountability and more transparency where money is being spent, what does it bring, what are the achievements, and where still, again, then we need to bring that back to national platforms and to work out on the solutions.
So another question from the floor is, where would you, the panel, say that the regulation of the framework for public-private partnerships should come from? Should it come from government, or should it come more from the private sector, or what's the right balance?
The partnership has to be balanced. Yeah. So it has to be both. I think, maybe someone can initiate, but the voices has to be equal at the end. If it has to be a real partnership, otherwise it won't be a real partnership.
Well, it starts here. It starts with dialogue, starts with being open to suggestions from each other,
It starts with sharing of information on what's going on, and linked to the previous question, enabling everybody to get access to the data on production and stocks and prices, because in some parts of Asia, those are state secrets, and that's a problem.
So just one more question. We've had a lot of discussion over the last couple of days about traceability and transparency, and it's in my mind at least, we have this old adage, you manage what you measure, but I think traceability and transparency suggests a new adage, which is you can't solve a problem if you're not even aware of it. And it strikes me that what we have now for the next generation really is increasing transparency, increasing light on problems around the world, and how we're going to solve those is a whole different thing. But the fact that they're going to be in our face, and there's going to be hundreds and thousands of them, and we're going to have to prioritize and figure out how to do that. I mean, some of these commodities are more, I would say, susceptible to issues than others. But we're in a new age here where information and big data is just going to be very difficult for all of us. The promise of big data is we can use it to predict. Right now what we're using it for is to document. And that's a fundamentally different kind of approach.
Well, what is definitely going to change is that it will be more and more difficult for companies to say, well, I just bought it on the spot market and I don't know where it comes from. And that's going to change, yes.
That's going to change pretty fast. So we're going to try, are they up yet? No.
And the other aspect about big data is, well, who here is in the Panama Papers?
Well, my organization is, yeah.
So here we have the voting on the results on rice. And I guess by far the scale knowledge extension, it's half of the votes. Outranked all the rest, with innovative public R&D coming in second. Can we move on to the next? Or maybe we can't.
It's only about rice here.
And on coffee, we have this a little bit closer. So support farmer organizations was slightly over half, and scale and improved capacity building was over a third. So those two really dominated the voting. It'd be great to see who was voting for what. You know, farmers voting for one thing, businesses for another, government. So on palm oil, again, over 40% for ultra transparencies. I don't know if that was about smoke and fires or whether it was about other things too. And then government improved consistency of laws across jurisdictions. The next, for dairy, wow. So that's another one where empowerment of farmers, especially women, came out on top with improved consistent feed availability. Next. Corn, and sugar. Okay, so here's a lot closer. Empower and strengthen local farmer associations, support technical improvements for farmers, and then the last two are also fairly large. Strong and beneficial relationship between farmers and millers, and encourage government to develop coherent regulatory framework. Oops, we just got some new votes. So now we have 2/3 for support technical improvements and empower and strengthen local farmer associations.
Whoa, yeah.
Vote early, vote often, you know. And I think corn is the last now.
Farmers, yeah.
So improve farmer education and increase opportunities for smallholders along the supply chain. I think that's good, right? That's it?
Yeah.
So let me just say a couple of things by way of conclusion, right? We're about time. As I was reading through and listening to these recommendations, it struck me that there were 5 things that came out in most of the recommendations. And I'll just summarize them briefly because the the last thing you need to do is hear me repeat everything you already just heard. We need platforms. We need more platforms that are pre-competitive, that are about sharing learning and knowledge, and maybe that are sector-wide approaches. We need solutions at scale and at speed. Came across in all of them in one way or another, from new technologies, R&D, to sharing more, to learning faster. We need to develop and implement new business models. ESOPs, joint ventures, aligned incentives along supply chains, long-term contracts, increasing income, scaling up approaches, efficiency. We need to focus on productivity and product quality. That came through in most of them as well. And finally, a lot of these were about the role of government. Doing more, doing different, doing less in some cases, enforcing laws, incentivizing more sustainable development, shifting ag subsidies from business as usual to innovation and more sustainable intensification. Trade and tariff issues were mentioned in a few of the, if you got down into the fine print. Price volatility, safety nets, health and safety, quality issues. Those were the major takeaways, at least from my perspective. But let me just add one other thought by way of conclusion. So by 2050, 70% of the people on the planet are going to live in cities. That's more people than are alive today. Every farmer is going to need to feed more people than they do today. And half of farmers today can't feed their own families. And this is the contradiction. This is what we have got to focus on. So what's the result that we want? Do we want to maintain poverty, or do we want to alleviate it? And if we want to alleviate it, that may mean the solution for many small farmers is not farming. They need other options, or at least their children do. And trying to plan a full employment program for small farmers is an exercise in futility. We have to plan for better futures. Thank you very much.